Good day, everyone. 'Tis I, the Blue Baron, defender of traditionalism. Today we're going to be doing a reactionary review of the Teen Titans Go Cinco de Mayo special, and using that as a springboard to teach about the true history of Mexico's last period of hope and prosperity. So let's not waste any time.
Buenos dias, amigos! You fools ready to celebrate Cinco de Mayo?
We here at Blue Baron Productions don't celebrate Cinco de Mayo. We celebrate Camaron Day, and its theme of fighting for the restoration of the Mexican Empire under His Imperial Majesty Emperor Maximilian.
What day is that again?
The 30th of April, to commemorate the strategic victory won on that day by Emperor Napoleon III of the French in support of the Mexican conservatives against the Republicans in Mexico at the Battle of Camaron.
Cinco de Mayo means the 5th of May.
But that's the day!
What are we celebrating exactly?
Oh, a lot of things. Treachery, rebellion, the return of bandits, thievery, and the eventual loss of hope for a grand and prosperous Mexican empire that Mexicans could take pride in, instead of yet another failed republic which Mexicans are leaving in droves and consider being sent back to as the cruelest thing imaginable. But you probably meant what event does it commemorate, didn't you? Cinco de Mayo commemorates the Republican victory over the French Imperial Army at Puebla on the 5th of May, 1862. Republican leader Benito Juarez had bet everything on holding Puebla, even though up to that time the French had been everywhere victorious. When the Mexican Republicans, under General Ignacio Zaragoza, a Tejano born in Golian, Texas, succeeded in defeating the French, a jubilant President Juarez immediately declared May 5th a national holiday. For those who care to know what Cinco de Mayo is all about, most at least know that much.
Basically, back in the 1800s, them colonizers was trying to take over Mexico.
But apparently Beast Boy doesn't even know that much.
Basically, back in the 1800s, them colonizers...
Alright, stop. Let's just address this picture first. First of all, the ships would have arrived on the east coast of Mexico, not the west, obviously, as they were a French expeditionary force sent by Emperor Napoleon III of the French during the Second Empire period and coming from France. Duh.
Basically, back in the 1800s, them colonizers...
Secondly, they weren't colonizers. This was a civil war more than anything. As I said, there were Mexican conservatives fighting alongside the French, and by all accounts, it was a continuation of the 3-year civil war known as the Reform War, which took place from 1857 to 1860 between the Mexican revolutionaries and the Mexican conservatives. The conservatives sadly lost that conflict, but that wasn't where it ended. You see, in the midst of that conflict, in 1859, Mexican monarchists led by José Pablo Martínez del Río approached the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph's younger brother, Archduke Maximilian, with a proposal to become the Emperor of Mexico, in restoration of the monarchy that independent Mexico was founded as. The Habsburg family had ruled the viceroyalty of New Spain from its establishment until the Spanish throne was inherited by the Bourbons. So Maximilian was considered to have more potential legitimacy than other royal figures, and was unlikely to ever rule in Europe due to his elder brother. On 20th of October 1861 in Paris, Maximilian received a letter from Gutierrez de Estrada asking him to take the Mexican throne. During all this, the French under Emperor Napoleon III sent their expeditionary force in aid of the Mexican conservatives, who quickly flocked to their banner, recognizing that it was only through the assistance of the French imperial forces that their dream of a grand, united, conservative Mexican state could come to fruition. At the invitation of Napoleon III, after General Élie Frédéric Foray's capture of Mexico City and a French staged plebiscite that confirmed the proclamation of the empire, Archduke Maximilian consented to accept the crown in October 1863 and was made His Imperial Majesty Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. His doubts and worries melted away as he learned Spanish, adopted Mexican dress and customs, and did everything he could to make himself thoroughly Mexican. Hardly the actions of a colonizer.
was trying to take over Mexico.
Thirdly, they weren't trying to take over Mexico. That's a grossly inaccurate and oversimplified statement. Napoleon was intervening in Mexico because he, like many others at the time, thought that a good, solid monarchy would be just the thing to deliver Mexico from the chaos of its continuous succession of republican dictators. While it was true that for the time being Emperor Maximilian needed the help of France, he proved he was a stooge for no one, even though he probably would have been better off if he had been. All too often the conflict is regarded as a contest between the Mexicans on one side and the French on the other. In fact, from the very beginning, even during the Battle of Puebla specifically, there were already Mexicans fighting for the French. This only became more pronounced with time, and the armies fighting for Mexican President Benito Juarez and those fighting for Mexican Emperor Maximilian were each quite diverse, though those supporting Maximilian were infinitely more so.
And everybody was like, oh snap, it's over, because there was like a ton of colonizers.
Actually, everyone was not like, oh snap, it's over. Many people were like, hooray, we're saved! Because there was a ton of foreign aid and international volunteers for their cause. As I said before, the armies fighting for Mexican President Benito Juarez and those fighting for the French and later Mexican Emperor Maximilian were each quite diverse, though those supporting Maximilian were infinitely more so. The French imperial forces, numbering roughly 38,453, were sent to aid the struggling Mexican conservative forces, who quickly rushed to fight alongside them, bolstering their strength by over 20,000 men. Many monarchist forces from around the world volunteered to help as well, including over 7,800 men from the Austrian Empire, 6,300 men and 19 ships from the Kingdom of Spain, 2,000 former Confederate soldiers who had fled to Mexico to escape the Union Army, over 1,400 men from the Kingdom of Belgium, 700 from the British Empire, and even a troop of Sudanese Africans sent by the Khedive of Egypt. The French also made use of colonial troops from the Caribbean islands, most of whom were African in origin. The diversity of the Mexican Imperial Army was seen even at the highest levels. Among the top commanders were General Miguel Miramon, a Mexican of Spanish blood, General Raul Mendez, a Mexican of mixed blood, and General Thomas Mejia, a Mexican of pure Indian blood. This shocked some in Mexican society, but Emperor Maximilian was adamant that Mejia was a talented general who deserved a rank that reflected his achievements. Again, hardly seems like a colonizer. He was also fond of saying that his Indian general most likely possessed an older bloodline than any of his European counterparts. There were also, of course, Marshal Achille de Bazaine and his French generals, the Austrian general Franz Count von Thun Hohenstein, born in what is Czechia today, or as I like to call it, Bohemia, the Belgian Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Baron van der Smissen, the American General John B. Magruder, the German Prince Felix zu Salm-Salm, and others. Some could even confuse those doing the classifying, such as the eventual turncoat Colonel Miguel Lopez, who was a Mexican born and raised, but whose skin was so fair and hair so blonde, many mistook him for a European officer. It should be pointed out that most of these forces were volunteers, or had been volunteered by their respective monarchs, who had nothing directly to gain from supporting the Mexican conservatives. Again, hardly the actions of colonizers.
But then the Mexican army dudes was like, nah, get out of here, fools!
Alright, I know I'm going back and forth here between the Battle of Puebla itself and the conflict as a whole, but please try to bear with me as this does serve a purpose. Now, not only did the Mexican Republicans not ultimately defeat the French imperial forces in that specific battle, they never ultimately defeated them, period. In fact, Napoleon III was forced to pull out just when his armies were on the cusp of victory. The life or death of the revived Mexican Empire ultimately depended entirely on the outcome of the American Civil War. The United States of America was never going to accept a French-backed monarchy in Mexico, and France was simply not strong enough to win in a fight against the Union forces, whose armies were vastly more numerous and much better equipped than his own. The only hope for success in the Mexican adventure was if the Confederates succeeded in winning their independence. Napoleon recognized this, but knew that his support alone would not be enough to ensure a Confederate victory, and while the British came close, they ultimately refused to get involved. Britain and France together might have ensured a Confederate victory and thus secured the safety of the Mexican Empire, but as that did not happen, Imperial Mexico was doomed as soon as the Confederates were defeated. Perhaps more than all the men and guns and supplies the U.S. sent to the rebels, it was Secretary of State Seward who brought the full diplomatic weight of the U.S. against both the presence of French troops in Mexico and the sending of any other European forces to Mexico to aid Emperor Maximilian. Thousands of Austrian troops, not all Austrians of course, were ready to set sail when Seward threatened Vienna with war if they did so, and the Kaiser backed down. Seward invoked the Monroe Doctrine, which claimed the Western Hemisphere as America's exclusive sphere of influence and a republics-only club. Ironically, this was the same man who had earlier in his career advocated that the United States annex Canada or Mexico, and perhaps even both. Napoleon III did not just retreat from Mexico, he was ordered to withdraw by the victorious Union forces, and he had no other choice in the face of the overwhelming force the USA could have deployed against him. From London to Paris to Vienna there were grumbles, but no one would ever dare to challenge the might of the United States, sadly enough. This is important to remember since the conflict in Mexico is so often portrayed as Mexico versus the foreigners, which it was not. It was a Mexican civil war as much as anything. While it is true that the Empire of Maximilian had the most help from foreign countries, it is no less true that the ultimate victory of the Republic of Benito Juarez is owed entirely to the United States. Mexican patriots would do well to give that some serious thought even today. They would also do well to give some thought to how Juarez at one point attempted to totally sell out Mexico and effectively make the country a U.S. protectorate, an offer thankfully that was turned down by the U.S., but which may as well be the case today. In other words, one could say that the real colonizers were the American forces who aided the Mexican revolutionaries. I've often said American pseudo-colonialism is far worse than actual colonialism.
And so Mexico won!
I'd argue that that's not actually the case. In addition to what I said about republicanism ultimately being extremely harmful for Mexico in the long run, even the immediate aftermath of the French withdrawal from Mexico was sorely felt by many Mexicans. Despite the popular perception, the French withdrawal was not always popular with the Mexican public, even those who had been non-aligned. In some small villages, the people begged the French to stay, as even the presence of just one man in uniform would save them from the ravages of the marauding but cowardly bandits and their common practice of extortion. But sadly, this was not possible, and the French army contracted its position further and further and began pulling out and marching to the coast. It was at this point that Maximilian displayed his true character and how different he was from the other Mexican leaders who had come before him and who would follow him. Traditionally in Mexico, it would have been at that point that Maximilian would have packed up, grabbed all the loot he could carry, and taken the first ship back to Europe to live the rest of his life in luxurious exile. This is what so many Mexican leaders had done before, and what many others would do after him. Yet Maximilian refused, for his high-born Habsburg principles would not allow him to abandon his loyalists who would be put to death for his sake, nor abandon his country and his people for whom he had sworn an oath to God at his coronation to serve and protect. Emperor Maximilian left his foreign volunteers behind and led his loyal Mexican troops into a hopeless last stand at the epic siege of Querétaro. Between March and May of 1867, Emperor Maximilian and his army were besieged at Querétaro by a massive Republican force. Surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and outsupplied, everyone in the city was impressed by how Maximilian met his most desperate hour. He gave his last bit of money to the poor on the streets, slept on the ground amongst his soldiers, shared their privations, and risked his life alongside their own. Finally, the end came through the treachery of a man Maximilian trusted, Colonel Miguel Lopez, known forever after as the traitor of Querétaro. Given one last chance to escape by the victorious Republican general, Maximilian again refused. If his loyal generals were to be shot for his sake, he would not abandon them to save his own life. Pleas and appeals came in to Benito Juarez from across the civilized world, from presidents and kings and liberals and conservatives alike, to spare the life of the noble Maximilian. Juarez would not hear of it. He feared that as long as Maximilian was alive, his own power would never be secure. As long as the emperor lived, the flame of monarchy would continue to burn, and he was determined to eliminate all resistance to his rule and his vision for a republican Mexico. He gave the order, and on June 19, 1867, Emperor Maximilian, General Miguel Miramon, and General Thomas Mejia were taken to the Hill of the Bells and executed by firing squad. Maximilian's last words were, "Long live Mexico!" The two generals flanking him both died, shouting in unison, "Long live the Emperor!" People mourned across the world. For some, it reiterated their prejudice that Mexico was simply a backward and barbaric country that Maximilian should have avoided. For others, even those who opposed the empire and supported republicanism and the revolution against Maximilian, it was a stain on their cause. In France, it was a black mark on the record of Napoleon III, who was held by many to have had the blood of Maximilian on his own hands, just as much as Benito Juarez. However, the pain did not end there. The Republican government in Mexico refused to return the body of the fallen emperor until the next year, when an Austrian frigate carried his ruined remains back to Vienna to bury in the Habsburg crypt. The Mexico he envisioned would never come to be, and immediately after this downfall, the country fell back again into the cycle of presidential tyrants, military coups, civil wars, and revolutions.
Cinco de Mayo.
And now he celebrates by having a party and eating that good food.
What many may not know is that traditionally May 5th has not been that big of a deal in Mexico. It is more so today, but even that is mostly because it became so widely known that May 5th was being much more widely celebrated in places in the US like Texas and California by Mexicans no longer living in Mexico. The popular image is of a tiny band of ragged but fierce Mexican soldiers driving back an immaculate army of French dandies. In fact, the odds were not grossly uneven, with about 4,500 Mexican Republicans facing about 6,000 French imperial troops. The French attack was not well planned, but even then it was a lack of ammunition that finally forced their retreat. Most importantly, however, and this is unpopular and so will probably never be accepted, is the fact that for all the celebrations of the Battle of May 5th, the whole thing was really pointless for the Mexican Republicans. It only delayed the inevitable. Emperor Napoleon III sent reinforcements to Mexico, reorganized the army command, and the following year on May 17th, the city of Puebla surrendered to the French, and shortly thereafter, Juarez abandoned Mexico City and fled north, clearing the way for the organization of a new government which eventually established the Second Mexican Empire under Maximilian. For the rest of the reign of Maximilian, the city of Puebla was under French, Mexican imperial, and Austrian protection. It was not until the final days of the empire that Puebla was retaken by the Juaristas on April 2nd, 1866. So, in looking at the big picture, one has to wonder just how worth celebrating the 5th of May is, even for those on the Republican side. It really only serves to show just how few and far between their victories were in open battle against the imperialist forces. However, the great dream of the Mexican Empire is something that I think is worth celebrating. And I would encourage all those who are monarchist, conservative, Christian, or who just honestly love Mexico and wish it to be stable and prosperous, to celebrate this with me. This is what I celebrated on April 30th, Camaron Day, and it is what I will celebrate again today. God bless you all, and remember, Viva Mexico and Viva el Emperador! Where's that music coming from? Hmm.